It doesn't really need to fill the room, I don't think. Do y'all think? Just for the recording?
Can you hear him in the back?
I can easily fill this room. You want to turn it down a little? Is that loud? For the room? All right. So thank you everybody for coming. I was joking once we had the recording. For those watching and not coming, a lot of people said, "Oh, you're recording it. I won't come to campus then." And they were joking, saying, "You should have saved that for after the talk." But I'm really excited for the people who are here. What I hope to do, and what makes it fun having a group this size, is we're going to have a better time talking than me just sharing what I'm going to do. So I'm going to do a quick overview of this study I started in 2024 around play and the stories people have been sharing about how play's in their life. And then I'd love to sort of open it up for discussion and conversation around what we think of play in our lives. And almost everybody has a story about that, so it should go really, really well. So here we go. A little bit about me. This is me. I'm a producer. I like making things, administrator. I like leading teams and running stuff. Sadly, I'm an academic. No, I'm not sad about that. Academic, I like studying stuff, and I'm a publisher who gets stuff out. I love to get things out and share things. I love doing open access publishing. So that's sort of my jam. This is a study that at the time I was calling Stories of, by, and for the Fields of Play. Started in 2024 when I was on sabbatical. And anybody who's a professor, sabbaticals are amazing. It was an exploratory qualitative study looking at the fields of play. It was going broad. I really focused on in-depth interviews, had a questionnaire, and a lot of community participation. I was looking at broad and diverse ideas around what play is in our lives. As I started getting the interviews and the questionnaires, I was looking for threads and themes, commonalities and difference across the people who were talking with me, and I was trying to find people from all these different groups, education, industry, government groups, professional organizations, foundations. And I had a lot of great support. I talked, these are some organizations that just gave me access to their communities so that I could sort of ping people and say hey, are you interested in talking about play? So that really helped generate, at first I was like, do the questionnaire. And then people were like, I'd be happy to talk, and that sort of took off for me, so it was really exciting. So thanks to all these organizations who sort of helped out. In the questionnaire, I had 116 respondents. It was long form, so the number one feedback I got was boy, that took a lot of time. So my apologies for anybody who filled it out. It was just 16 questions, kind of roughly around. I was asking people where they worked, how long they'd been in the area, what their roles and responsibilities were, what area, sort of field and area, oh, I'm in the games industry and I'm a tech person. Their strategies and tools they use at their work and how they use play, and then connections and interests they have just in general. I ended up got 175 interviews because people kept offering and I was on sabbatical and I had time. And it was amazing the generosity of people who I interviewed. There are 2 people in the room who I interviewed actually. They were mostly around 30 minutes or so. And when I started, I was like, I'll do this questionnaire and I'll do some interviews. But people kept offering, and to be honest, they were so inspirational that I was like, okay, I'll schedule interviews. I'll keep going. I was very open-ended and just asking some general questions like, please introduce yourself, tell me who you are, the story of how your work, life, interests relate to play from your perspective, and then what are they finding exciting in their lives. It's just general things I tried to keep on track, and I was actively listening, and if Heather was talking about something, I'd go, oh, I know, I want to follow up on that question. And these interviews were exciting for me for another reason as well. They inspired me to spin off Play Story Press. It's an open access community publishing consortium. I founded it in 2024 after maybe, I don't know, I was about halfway into the interviews and be like, these people are amazing. And we have ETC Press, which was founded out of CMU 20 years ago now, an open access press there. And I was like, could we take this idea of open access publishing and make it of the field instead of in the ivory tower? And CMU was very supportive of it. They're like, well, we're going to keep the name, but yes, you can. So it was great talking to the provost, and we spun this up, and it's Diamond Open Access Scholarly Publishing Initiative, sharing ideas around impact and significance in our society. And I'm really curious, very broadly, stories and play as applied across fields, looking at entertainment and narrative, media studies, social studies, games and technology, health and enjoyment, and wellness, education, learning, design, and development. We wanted to go broad, like what are people thinking about that sort of relates to play and narrative. We're hoping to grow quality scholarship for the field. We have a consortium, which is another about 26 nonprofits now that are involved with this initiative to help just think about how to openly share knowledge together across our communities. We have an advisory of two advisories of about 48 professionals from industry, academics, professional organizations, like helping do the peer review. We have partner organizations, and that was something we set up where, oh, you're an organization that does the proceedings, we can help you publish that. That organization does the call, does the peer review, does all of that, and they just basically pass it something that we help publish, mint a DOI, and get it out. And we have a society, which is a bunch of people who are generous and donate to help support the press and its operations. It's scholar-led and mission-driven. Like I was talking to a colleague in Tepper, we were just talking about Tepper, and they're like, so why do you want to do an open access press? Oh, it must be mission-driven. You're not making money, right? And I joked that, open access, you try to lose the least amount of money. It's peer-reviewed work, but with a general audience focus. We want things to be conversational instead of jargon-heavy. And we're, very open to theory and practice. So, hopping back to the study, my process was, at first I thought I was going to travel a lot and go see people in person. But, for family reasons, it was like, I better stay close to home. So I did all of them on Zoom, and I did the recording and transcription through Zoom itself. And the transcription was good enough for my purposes. I'm actually going to probably retranscribe them to get a little more fully fleshed out transcription. I used G-Form for questionnaire, Atlas TI, and I tested a whole bunch of analytics software. And it was really interesting because anybody who's got a sort of user interface background, Atlas TI, I could figure out how to make it work without reading the instructions. So I'm like, somebody's did some really good interface design because this just makes sense. So it really worked for me. And then when I was writing and putting everything together, I was using GDocs and Vellum. Vellum's a little formatting publishing application. Just to give you a sense of what I was doing. And my analysis was around, I was looking at the interviews and I started pulling quotes. I was very curious about something like Heather would say, or Eric's the other person. I'm just outing you right now. I was looking for quotes. I was coding those quotes, developing a coding system about, I think this quote's about improv, for instance, or this one's about process, and then Atlas TI calls it memos. In my mind, it's footnotes. I'm like, oh, this one reminded me of, and I want to make sure I remember. Like I remember the first person who talked about kids in terms of their play. And I'm like, oh, this is the first person who said family's important. And then everybody started talking about family. And then both myself and a student research associate were taking notes and reflections as we were sort of coding and analyzing and cleaning up the interviews. And we sort of incorporated that into the analysis. So here's some of this is the coding in general in terms of, it's just a nice little heat map of like what, people talked a lot about culture and play, of course, and games came up and community. So this gives you a sense of how things got coded. During the interviews, this is where the coding kind of laid, what people brought up the most topically. I didn't clean it up because thing right in the middle, but that is something that's interesting when you pass the quotes back to people like, oh, I say thing a lot, don't I? And it was, so like, I'll talk about this more. The ebb and flow of, I didn't clean up the interviews before I let them suck into Atlas TI, so the number one topic was my name, because I was in every interview. And you know how Zoom timestamps, so like Drew Davidson's everywhere. I was like, this is the questionnaire. Just give me a sense of what came up where the questionnaire was going. And then the progress. I was really curious about those threads of themes. I was trying to start pulling together, and this is where it was both like creative problem solving and let it manifest. I was like, oh my God, it feels like we're in conversation with each other, even though I'm just having one-on-one conversations with people. Like a lot of similar topics would come up, and so that, instead of just, my first thing is I'm gonna do interviews and I'll do something with this. I'll analyze them and write something about it. And then the idea of like a thematic oral history is like, well, I could pull these together. A lot of people talk about improv. I could pull those quotes together. So I started treating it more as a collaborative journey with these participants. Like I would ask them, for input. I give them monthly updates and ask them what they'd like to do, if they like this idea or not. Some people have opted out because they're like, I thought this was just an interview, and now you're making a card game? What the? And I was just amazed by the generosity and expertise shared. The people who shared their time, they've stayed engaged and invested. They really shared ideas and opinions. So all those, I hope to honor and represent those perspectives through the work moving forward. And I say, like, my overall methodology, I've just tried to be really open to where it would go, because it felt appropriate since we were talking about play, but also I was intentionally didn't share a definition of what I thought play was, which some of our academic colleagues were like, well, tell me what you think it is. And I was like, no, you tell me. I want to know, because I didn't want to like limit it, or because it was fun. I ended up, out of those 170 people, there were like musicians and athletes and game designers and academics and children's media and child psychologists and theater people and artists and designers. And that just blew my mind. The range of people were like, no, play relates to what I do. So that was fun to keep it open, because then people sort of opted into like, here's what play means to me. And it fostered a lot of discussion and made for a lot of surprises for me. It was like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. So they were really sharing their perspectives, and the stories were just amazing. And it allowed me to sort of meander, like I was following the ideas where they went. So like I said, oral history wasn't the first idea, and I was like, God, it feels like we're talking to each other, talking with each other even. So I think an oral history format would be really appropriate for this. Somebody said they would love to hear other interviews. Could I make it a podcast? And I was like, that's not a bad idea. I have all the recordings. They weren't intentionally recorded to be a podcast, so they were Zoom, so some audio is great and some audio is garbled. But we were like, maybe we could do that. And through colleagues here at Carnegie Mellon, I don't know if people know Lori Weingart up at Tepper. I was talking to her about what tools I should use, and so I was just telling her what I was up to study. And she's like, you should talk to Kenneth Go, who some of us might know from the ETC. He did a study on the ETC. He's now at Singapore Management University, leading innovation there. And so I talked to him, and he got interested in this study and goes, could we do quantitative analysis of it in terms of like a data-driven approach? And in both cases, in all cases actually, I asked the interviewees if they were okay with that. So I just would send out an email going, are you okay if we use what we have for a podcast or not? And if they said no, no harm, no foul. And if they said yes, I will then allow them to opt out if they listen to it and go, oh my God, that's horrible. Can I re-record an interview if it's going to be a podcast? And the same with like quantitative analysis. I'm like, are you okay if they, sort of lightly de-identify it so they can just literally go through in terms of doing a quantitative data analysis? And people said sure, and some people said, not really. So it was a very improvisationally yes and approach throughout the process. So like I said, thematic oral history started surfacing as a way to represent this. I had threads that were really coming up, like improv, experience, family was one, a big thread, culture, games, of course, came up. So looking at those topics, looking for patterns across interviews, looking for the ideas that were being shared. And to capture those perspectives, I used the codings to start creating those resonant groupings. So what's interesting, again, it's like learning as I'm going through the process. Like I dumped it all into Atlas TI, and then I was literally just pulling the codes out. So to date, I don't have like full transcripts of interviews. I'd pull a code out, a quote, I mean. And so like, Heather's seen this, and so like, here's your dozen quotes that I pulled out of the interview. Are they okay? We're cleaning them up. And I start grouping those by the codes. So those quotes were starting to get tagged related to the themes I saw. And I started looking for relational ways to connect the meanings. And in the similar way that I felt the interviews were in conversation with each other, I started hitting the corpus of there's so much written about play and from so many perspectives. So I was fascinated to actually start incorporating citations within the conversational flow, because I feel like it's like, oh my God, we've been talking about play for a long time, and we're still figuring it out, because play is amorphous and ambiguous and confusing and good and risky and all those things. And then with the commentary from myself and the grad research assistant, that helps provide some context for why these themes sort of surfaced. And this is how the book sort of came together. It's like this amalgamation. And I got really music. Music was a big topic that came a lot. It was fun talking to musicians, because they would just wax poetic about the playfulness of being on stage playing music, and one, getting that sort of lock-in with other people playing together, and then two, having the audience get going. And then you're like, there's nothing like it, as a lot of musicians would say. So like it feels like there was a lot of symphony happening. There's melody, harmony, some cacophony in there. But so like I have all these, this kind of works on two levels for me. If you think of the little boxes in number one is all the quotes, I slowly started looking through the quotes, and number two kind of, I'm gathering them together. And I'd shuffle them and go, that's a conversation, number three. And then similarly with the themes, I'll go, okay, these are all the themes. Let's start shuffling together, see how they relate to each other. And I end up, I'm trying to write a book. What blew my mind is this graphic is from my dissertation from 25 years ago. That's how I wrote my dissertation. But at the time, I printed it out, cut up the slips of paper, folded them, shuffled them together, made photocopies, and and I was like, oh, this time I was able to do it digitally. So much easier. So it just kind of blew my mind. I was like, oh, this is kind of how I think. So next steps in the study. The book's evolved into two versions, believe it or not. A draft is with the interviewees, like Heather. It's been a good interviewee and already got me back her edits. Eric has yet to reply, no pressure. Publicly on the recording. The reason two books started happening is while, like I was saying, it felt like we were in conversation together. It started feeling like the themes were in conversation with each other. So like improv really related to the theme of culture or experience. And I was just like, I'm itching to make them get together. And I was like, maybe I'll try it. And so I sort of got a first draft that's very scholarly, and I call it the playing it straight draft, where it's like everything's in order, everything's organized, there's references at the back. You can find things pretty easily. And then I literally tore those sections apart and shuffled them together intentionally. And so this one's just all this, they're interwoven, they're threaded together, and I call it playing around. And to me, that's the ultimate version. The playing it straight feels penultimate, but they kind of need each other, because if you see them together, all of a sudden you see how, I feel like it manifests the playfulness of the story shared, seeing it in two different versions, even if it's the same content. And I was like, let's go. And so four people like, okay. So we're doing that right now, looking for people, like I know I was talking to Harrison before, it's like, I want people to weigh in on their quotes and feel comfortable with it, because it's all of a sudden out of context in a way than from the original interview. I'm looking for further analysis and publications beyond the book, working with the quantitative analysis, helping support each other, think about other ways to represent this, going to do full interview transcripts. The podcast is in play, interviews. We're actually doing events like this type of conversation. I've done it at a couple conferences, and now we're going to do a half-day event. I think I told Harrison about this, where it's like we're going to get together, have conversations, and then we're going to make a meal together. And so it's like, there's something, like food came up a lot in the conversation about how important that is with play. A couple people suggested you could do a card game, which I think would be wonderful, but again, talk about taking it even further out of context. And not to be bragging about the group of people, they're amazing game designers in these interviews, so it's going to be interesting to go, we're going to try a card game, and there's some people that are just world-renowned game designers who are going to critique what we think of. Somebody said a coffee table book, and I'm like, okay, what does that mean? So sort of like that yes and, like how do we share the idea of these playful stories in various contexts just to get it out there. And like for me, the card game is, there's several storytelling decks. This idea is like, could you use a set of cards to help people share stories, like I hope we'll do as well after we sort of finish this. So like for me, in terms of playful stories, it's like the Latin sort of Ludic Narrans. It's a big sort of academic game study, sort of like these are these playful stories that games enable us to tell. And I'm like, oh my God, that's what we're doing right here. And like I said, it's really been manifesting. I'm like seeing where it takes me and how it gels. And I really want to honor the expertise and generosity and the participation of the interviewees. So it's coming together as a tapestry and collage. In a way, it feels like I was pulling things together and like actually working with an artist who will be unnamed, but I'm married to her. And she's gonna do the illustrations for the book, and she's working on that. A weird thing that came up for me personally, and it came up a couple times in the interviews, is a big part of how I think about play comes from the fact that I grew up on the water. And so I was always swimming or surfing or sailing or skiing or canoeing or, and I was on the coast of North Carolina, so we had hurricanes. And so there's the good, sometimes that's the price you pay for living in paradise, but we'd have to like batten down because everything's coming. And so it's like this ebb and flow of like following where the leads go, making mistakes and kind of keep seeing where it goes, having an idea and going back. And so it also thinks that surf and turf comes to my mind of like, we can't control the way the wind blows, but we control how we set the sails. You know, when you're surfing, you can't control the wave, but you're like in this dance with nature, and that feels really playful to me. And then turf, we were talking about this earlier, it's like, in my mind, it's like, I want grit, I want friction in what's going on. Like somebody asked, like, you could have just pushed a button and had AI summarize all this for you. And I was like, no, I love the fact that I read through these interviews multiple times in close detail. And that I feel like that work was really important to how this is shaped, as opposed to just going, I got a summary, I'm done. Not that the AI is, has no advantages, but I love I guess I'm like a 90s Gen X, like I did the work. But also, and I kid you not, this study's changed my life just by talking to 175 people. It's like really just like got me going. Like I was finishing one interview, and after we were like, okay, we're gonna stop recording, I was talking to Betty G, shout out to Betty G, and she was like, this could be the rest of your career. This is such a generative, area. And I was like, yes, please. This is wonderful. I love this. And that said, what came up a lot is we can suck. It's something I talk about with our students when we're doing creative collaborations together, working on teams. Sometimes working with people is the hardest part of your day. We're in academics, and literally was just talking about some of the craziness of academic politics. What is that aphorism? The academic politics are so ugly because the stakes are so low, and there's like all of that, but at the same time, in a cognitive dissonant way, we're amazing. We're awesome. Like humans are just wonderful. And that gets to something I often tell students too, is like, at the very least, like, here's the secret. I'll help you stand out. You'll be amazing if people will remember you. And it's like, just be kind. Just be nice. And you'll stand out. That's how low the bar is. And people are like, oh, I can do that. And I'm like, I know, but you'll get busy. You'll get stressed. You'll get distracted. And we have 2,000 alums now at the ETC, and I bet you a dozen keep in touch. And that's not saying I want the other 1,900 to get in touch, but the ones that do keep in touch, I remember them. And I like to say, like, who cares? Like, commit. It's become really easy to, like, play your cards close to your vest. But, like, it's really interesting to talk to people who really care about what they're doing, who's like their life, their work, their interests are infused by some sort of sense of purpose, meaning, playfulness. And like I was just saying, this study gave me hope. Like I started it 2024. We're living in interesting times right now is a nice way to put it. Dumpster fire might be another way to put it. And that sort of stress, and then thinking about there's people out there doing that. And I feel like if there is going to be change, it's going to happen through people doing things differently, and that takes playfulness. Like if you're going to do something and try something that's never been done before, you have to take that risk and take that, And I'm like, you can take it big to little. Sort of like, could we create a system that's not capitalistic, that generates wealth and shares it more just evenly? I don't see why not. There's just a lot of forces that will say that's impossible. But like Ursula K. Le Guin said, once upon a time, we believed in the divine right of royalty. And we don't really believe in that anymore. So we can imagine something else. And like I said, I think we can make those changes. And just as little as, I was just saying it, I talked to 175 people, and I really think it changed my life. It changed me because I read them all. So I feel like I'm a different person because of going through this. And it was just talking to 175 people. It's not hard, but it takes time and attention. So that's kind of like the study in a nutshell, really quickly. I hope it gave you a little context, because the fun part for me now would be, I know we're recording and we can make this really hard for Dave to capture later, but I'd love for us to just sort of like, I'm happy to take any questions, but also just, I'm gonna start asking questions of you all, because I think we have an amazing group of people here who in some way, shapes, or form plays a part of your lives. So thanks for your quick time and attention. 2 mics. We can do a duet.
We can do a duet.
Any questions?
I can walk to you with the microphone. Yeah.
Yeah, Drew, you said you learned as you went. So as you were going through and doing these interviews, you learned things. Like maybe the improv didn't surface until you were 20 interviews in. Did you change what you asked based on what you were learning? And if so, do you want to go back to those first interviewees and have another discussion freshened by what you learned?
Oh my God, great question. Yes, of course. Almost yes across the board. Definitely learned stuff I was going. I remember at first I had, instead of asking what's exciting for you, I was also asking, what do you think could improve in the world? And then somebody made this really great point of like, I don't like to think about improving when so much is going well. I want to think about how all boats can rise. And I was like, made me think about how to rephrase certain questions. I talked to 2 people the day after they lost their jobs. So it was really, I was more sensitive about saying, what are you excited about? Because literally, before we hit recording, I'm like, do you want to talk? Because before they're like, I just lost my job. I'm like, oh, we can talk later. And they're like, no, I'm okay. I'm like, all right, thank you. You know, but I was more careful. So I would love to like revisit it and keep conversations going. And what else happened? I talked to somebody the day after the election. So they were like, I was up all night crying, you know. And so that was like, well, we don't have to talk right now. No, let's talk. And so that really happened. So I felt like I got better at helping elicit people's sharing of stories as I was going along. So it'd be fun to keep it. And a lot of them were like, if you're going to do a podcast, can I just do another one? So that I know it's going out in that way. I'm like, oh, yeah, sure.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Okay, this is what you get for picking on me so much. 4 times.
Oh,
but
okay.
You said that this project has really changed you and you're a different person. Tell us more. What changed? What were you before and how is it? Who are you now?
That's a good question. I would say I'm gonna try to be as honest as I can without oversharing TMI. I used to be much more cynical about, like, it was sort of almost like an existential challenge for me around like humanity and are we a net negative or a net positive? And I would probably have argued net negative. You know, if you just look at the history of humanity on this planet and how we treat each other, how we, you know, and then I was like, what do you do about it? Like, me trying to do one thing, I don't think it's ever going to move the needle in a direction. And it was weird during the pandemic going, man, if we disappeared, the rest of the world would be like, yes, you know, it's better now. So there was that sort of like skepticism, cynicism, and talking to people was like, okay, sure, but now I just feel more hopeful that there's a chance for us. Like, it was just blown away by how people just kept sharing, kept offering, and my wife had, a lot of you know my wife, but would have to put up with me coming downstairs going, oh my God, I just talked to Heather, and she was saying, you know, and she knows you, but you know, it's like, it was this, she was like, you always come down just full of energy. It's like, and she was the first one who sort of said, feels like you're getting hopeful because of this. And I was like, it's hard not to say yes, you know. And it's been really great because sometimes you read the news and you're like, oh, I just read the news. I need to detox almost, you know. And then it's like, well, let me dig into this and think about it. I'm like, all right, there's hope for us. So I feel like I've gotten a little bit more positive in my life. Not that I was Debbie Downer. Saturday Night Live.
I have a question. Talking or listening to you talk about musicians collaborating with each other and also a crowd listening to them, cooking with other people. I grew up playing a lot of team sports, and there's like a competitive aspect to me to play, or it was growing up.
Right.
And what you just said about interacting with other people maybe changed your worldview a little bit, or at least was energizing in the moment.
Right.
That's also very much my experience. And I just want to know if you could talk more about what is it about human interaction that has a positive benefit on either our minds or our bodies, our nervous systems, and like why does that seem to work for human beings or, you know, anything at all? Because it seems like you've done a lot of research.
Yeah, well, it's like, I think, and I'd love for people to share. Don't let me be the only one answering. Because I think, like, you know, I know Dan has an opinion about that question. He's like, no, I wasn't listening. No. What's fascinating, particularly coming out of the pandemic, where everybody was trying to solve the problem of, like, how do you make humans feel like they're together? And I don't think anybody cracked that. You know, I remember the Game Developers Conference tried to do basically a version of chat roulette. It says like, hey, if you want to just like randomly meet somebody, I'm like, well, no, that's not how it works. I'm standing in the hallway and I see Harrison who's standing by, and he's like, you should meet Dave. And the magic starts happening because you're just in space together, and like hitting a button and going, I'm getting a random person, didn't feel the same at all. And so there's something where I don't know if there's a digital replacement. I do believe people have substantive, real relationships that are completely mediated through the internet or online and stuff like that. And we were talking about avatars and representations of ourselves in the digital sphere, and how in some ways that's how more people know me than face to face, because they've only seen my email handle or that little image I have. My wee me is the thing I use for a lot of stuff, and it kind of looks like me still, even though I'm gray now. So I think like there's that, and like so much research around, oh my gosh, it does, physically we get these endorphins running and this dopamine hit, and we just sort of get a charge from that. And just, socially it helps us just sort of settle. And we were talking, one time I was talking to a group, and somebody brought up and going, I just went through some major surgery and I don't feel playful, but I know it's valuable, what do I do? And sometimes it's like, playful can just be, we're just talking. And like that person, and we were literally right before the talk venting about certain things, and you could tell both of us going, it was nice talking to somebody who understands the pain that we're sharing with each other. And I was like, I felt like that was good. And so maybe that's as much as you can do right now, because you're sort of recovering from all the medical stuff. But it just like, that's magic. And like, there's that great study where it's like, can you sit and look at somebody for, I can't remember if it's 3 or 5 minutes. And Maria and Abramovich did that in the museum, and you watch it happen. But they're like, just do it with anybody. And like, people will literally go, I started falling in love with that person. I started crying and I don't know why. And you're just trying to maintain eye contact with not, because it's really easy to go, I'm looking at Dave, I'm going to glance. So we're not intensely focusing, but just something about that. And then a lot of us have pets or nature, or like we have those types of relationships, and there's something really warm, like just, they've shown that looking at a picture of the woods is good for you. Being in the woods is even better, and my wife and I start every day doing a walk in the woods with our dog. Because let's be honest, dogs are better than people. No offense to anybody in this room. But sort of like that. So there's just so much value to it. And play, like I was just talking with a student who she's like, can we use games to help people sustain their social connections instead of like, you have to do it outside of the game? And I was like, oh, there's all kinds of things you can think about. And like, remember how Second Life tried to be like, Second Life is your life over here. And now there's a gazillion university campuses still abandoned in Second Life. Although it's still active, which is crazy. And there's just adult zones now and all kinds of stuff like that, and all fair play there. But it just fascinates me about how playfulness can make people feel comfortable. Like you're taking a risk. So a big thing that came up was safety. Do we feel safe enough to share? So to take that risk. Like all of our students, for those of you who are not from the ETC, go through improv together. And so like I said, it came up a lot. I was surprised how much it came up. And Brenda Baker-Harger, the professor who teaches it, I made sure I interviewed her because I wanted it to come up because I knew she'd bring it up. But then it came up so much. Like a lot of people just talk about how it's so, and it's like getting comfortable with the unknown and the uncertainty of like, can we play well together? And you're on stage and it feels like something's up. That sort of yes and sort of philosophy. It's where the magic happens.
I was really curious about, in all of these interviews that you've done, did anyone teach you to make anything that you've never made before?
Teach me. Not directly. Some people made me want to, like, I love music. I was joking right before the recording, like, who has the best taste in music? And immediately somebody said, Dave. I'm like, wow, no hesitation. And music's just a huge part of my life. It's always playing. Like, songs are in my head all the time. And I don't know, have you seen those studies where some people don't have emotional reactions to music? And I'm like, oh my God, listen to the right song and I'll cry, or I'll just get jazzed or I'll get pumped up. And I was like, and some people, whatever, they're not wired that way and they don't, music doesn't impact them. And I'm like, oh, that's a big part of my life. So when I was a kid, my mom was like, my parents, but mostly my mom was like, we're going to make you do something and you have to do it for a year and then it's up to you. So like piano lessons, a team sport, you know, and I took piano and I hated the teacher. So I did it for a year and I bailed because I was having more fun doing, I think, soccer at the time. And now I'm like, man, music's such a big part of my life, I can't play. And the musicians are like, oh my God, to play with somebody. It's just so powerful. And so a lot of that, you know, like, and the idea of like teaching somebody, so, you know, like your comfort food, that came up. You know, it's like, could we share comfort foods? Where it's like, I grew up with this and this means a lot to me. Like I was talking to 2 of our students, one from the Caribbean and one from southern India. And the Caribbean was like, conch. That's my comfort food. And we were both like, conch, oh my God. And he just talked about how he made it. Like you have to hang the conch on a clothesline so it slips off the shell, and then you basically slice it into steak patties, as it were, and then you grill them. And he's like, oh, it just takes me back. So good. And the student from South India was like, calf's brain and milk. And they're like, oh, and of course I'm like, calf's brain and milk, that does not seem to be something I'd put together. But it was just fascinating to sort of share that. And that's the idea of what came up, like, well, we could do an event and there's gotta be food involved where we share something like that, because it's so powerful. Because I love to learn different cuisines. And you know, sometimes you're like, I wanna learn, like my wife will, like, I'm make an Indian dish and it's so complicated to make it just for 2 people. So she's like, oh, it's so hard to make something where I'm getting all these ingredients I don't have around anyways, but it's so much fun to try. And like since the pandemic, we're pretty plant-based. And so she's gotten really good at creating umami out of anything. Where you're like, oh, that's delicious. Like she can make veggie burgers that you think are real, just in terms of the umami and stuff. Dan had a question. Oh, you first. Yeah.
Okay. Kind of, going off the example, I guess, when he was asking a question about, and you said the example of like someone who had just surgery, who's like, I'm not in the state of really mind of play. I know you might have talked to a lot of folks who already embrace that as a concept or an idea, or they have like the headspace for it. Did you run into anyone who was sort of like resistant to like the idea, or it's like they don't really live in that perspective, and you know, I don't have time to play, or it's like I'm serious about whatever else it is, so that's not like a part of my life? And if you did run into that, like how did you orient the conversation?
Yeah, it did come up in a couple ways. It's weird because I think just since I was asking for people, you know, particularly at the beginning, I'd finished an interview, go, should I talk to anybody? You know, and everybody go, oh, so-and-so. So there's a bit of a self-selection, like, oh, I'm interested to talk about play. And so they were coming to me for that. But I had some people, and I don't want to pick on academics, but a couple academics who were like, I study play, and they were the most serious about it. You know, which, you know, that's their area and their expertise, so I get it. But it was interesting to, it's like, oh, this is your expertise, and you're very serious about it. And then it was fun too, and I didn't really break it. Like I think it's going to come out as we do more quantitative and demographic data. I talked to people who were retired. I talked to people in school. I didn't talk to kids because of IRB. Like I worked with CMU's IRB, and I was like, I want to do journalistic interviews. And they're like, you don't need IRB. Because I was like, I want to be able to go, Heather Kelly said this, as opposed to, you know, somehow getting a sign off. And I worked with them on the questionnaire to make sure it was completely anonymous. So that I didn't have to really worry about it. Like the questionnaire, I didn't know who it was. The interviews, I knew exactly who it was, and intentionally so. But it was interesting to talk about the range of people. And a big thing that came up was less like a personal resistance and more like a noticing of a systemic and cultural resistance. And it seems like across time and generations and maybe the whole world, there's this idea of like, you need to grow up. You need to be serious. The people will start thinking you're not responsible if you're too silly. And several women in particular brought it up and were like, we've been advised to not be too playful because it will get doubly judged as being too, you know, frivolous and unserious, you know. And they're like, and I said, screw it. I'm gonna rebel, and I want my job and my life to be fun. And if they can't take it, you know, so they're taking the risk intentionally. Same with people from minority perspectives. Like, I'm the only Black American in my company, so They're sort of like, I feel like I have the standard I need to uphold, but also we're a game company and we're supposed to be having fun making what we make. But that's like one of the saddest things. And I mean, some of it, y'all remember Bowling Alone? That book by Richard Putnam? Might be Robert Putnam. It was an article in the 90s, and a book came out right around the turn of the century, and it's just a systemic study of our culture, particularly stateside, of how we're not really playing together anymore. And a couple of the emeritus professors that I talked to, whose expertise is sort of like playing culture, were like, and that's why our civilization's falling apart. We no longer play well together. All of us, you know, there's like these weird distinctions like sports, but sports commodify, you know. Big thing that came up was like, do you pay to play? Because play's kind of free, but man, capitalism wants to make you pay. You know, how can we monetize whatever you're getting joy out of? So that you have to pay for that was a thing that came up. And like, you know, some of the experts were talking about like free play and how it's rarely free, even kids, because it's sort of like, we all know how to play, but we're no longer really experts. Like a kid, I mean, that's how we learn. And like Mike was talking about his grandson, and it's like 1 year old, and this is what gives them joy, you know. And they're like in there, and then slowly through like school, all of a sudden they're gonna be like, I can't be too rowdy, I can't be too, you know, crazy, that people will think you know, they have to start behaving and being quiet and raise their hand when you have to go to the bathroom. And we had a neighbor once who, their son, when they first went to kindergarten, somehow had learned from friends before kindergarten, like, you can go outside and pee in the bushes. So did that on the first day of kindergarten. And the teacher's like, what? And, you know, the kid learned the lesson. Like, okay, I have to ask. And there's a bathroom in the building. So weird stuff like that, I think, came up. So a lot of people were aware of it and wanted to do it, just, I think, kind of self-selected that way. But they were talking about things they had to struggle against and the awarenesses of people trying to tamp it down and encouraging them not to. And stuff like that. And that just feels like, oh, my God. And, you know, I feel like we came through the pandemic going, no, I think we all need to play. It shouldn't it, but it kind of feels like it's swinging the other way back again. You know, right now it's like, oh my God, everything's deathly serious, and it is, but it's like the only way I know how to sort of keep myself mentally healthy is to think about doing things that give me that sort of release. And I love like Dave's questions about sports. I talked to several athletes. I talked to like athletes that were, you know, pros, and it was fascinating talking to them about how that becomes something where your play becomes your job, and then the joy starts draining away. But the community aspect of it, and just having a team. Some of them were like, I'm a tennis pro, or I'm a golf. And, you know, and some of them, no, I was on a football team, so we had each other's backs. Or as volleyball, you know, it's just a deep, sort of tightly constrained set of play. Like games, you know, came up a lot, and how games are, you know, a form of play, but within a certain structure. Where sometimes, you know, but we kids give play structure almost immediately. Like, you know, you can't touch the red ball. No, okay, all of a sudden the red ball's all, you know, they start making rules almost right away, just to make the play fun. What's that? Wasn't it Bernard Suits was the one who said, like, games are just like unnecessary obstacles to get in the way of your goal. And he used golf as an example. He's like, you know, if you could just take that ball and put it in the hole, that's a lot easier. That's not a fun game, though. Well, what if you can just throw the ball? Pretty accurate, but what if you have to hit it with a stick? You know, all of a sudden it's like, well, we're making it more complicated, but it's becoming more skillful and more challenging. And that's a big part of the thing. Challenge is a big part of play. You know, if it's too easy, you kind of, I'm bored. It's like Csikszentmihalyi's notion of flow. It's too hard. You're like, this isn't fun. You have a question, or is it Dan's turn?
Oh, thanks. Is it on? I was just curious, in the questionnaire, which seems to have happened before you did the in-person.
Yeah, like it went out first,
Yeah.
And then I started doing interviews. Yeah.
So I'm curious, in the questions, did you use the word play?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, because I was wondering if play emerged from the more generic questions. But
Well,
yeah, anyway.
To be fair, I don't know if the question specifically said play. The framework said play. Like, I'm very curious about, because my initial conception was like, oh, I'm really curious to go like, what regions around the world seem more playful, and what are the characteristics of those regions that seem to support that? And I kind of had like a hypothesis of like, I'm curious to go to places that have really good universities, good education, you know, strong industry presence, and like generative things, you know. So some of you are like, well, Austin, Texas came to mind. And it was interesting, as a lot of people talked about place, and I know some of us in this room have lived in Austin, and Austin came up the most as a place that people go, like in terms of pride and thinking of play. Seattle was a close second, San Francisco in there, but Austin really came out. New York came up, like we've joked, we're all living in Pittsburgh, and I've talked to people like who are at New York, and they're like, oh, you know, so-and-so just happened to be in New York, they came by. You know, somebody world famous, and I'm like, nobody happens to come by in Pittsburgh. We invite them, and they come, and they're charmed, but, you know, you just don't get those drop-ins like you do in New York City or San Francisco or, you know, stuff like that. So, like, there was that framework of it. Oh, and just thinking about frames, well, this book blew my mind. Celia Pierce, who's at Northeastern, her most recent book is called Play Frames, and it's brilliant. It's problematizing the notion of a magic circle, because she makes the argument that play and our lives are not separate. They ebb and flow with each other, and they bleed and blend. And so she uses the idea of frames to start thinking about how we know we're playing, when we're playing, you know, and so it just really made me start thinking about how play fits into your lives in ways where you can be at work and be playful. And as opposed to, no, it's this magic circle you enter, and it's separate from the work you're doing. And so I think she did some really nice stuff there that made me think about play in new ways as well. So it was contextualized that way, but then I think the question was like, where do you live? What do you do? You know, because at first I thought, I want to hear what Seattle has. And then it just sort of like, oh my God, people are amazing. I want to hear more about that. Like just their stories and what they share.
If anyone caught Everest Pipkin, who was here as part of the School of Art lecture series, just gave a really great talk that feels like it must be bridging off of what Celia was writing in Play Frames. Also talking about problematizing the magic circle, talking about the garden, but in terms of the Cloisters Unicorn Tapestry series.
Okay.
And thinking about the surface of gameplay and browser-based gaming where you can always see the source code.
Oh, that's interesting. Because we did talk to like Hyman Gingold. Do people know him? Sort of academic designer, scholar. He worked on Spore and Sims and stuff. His newest book is a deep, oh wow, mouse.
It is winter. They do come here. We can't stop them.
They're welcome in my book. I just saw it. He did a book on the ins and outs of SimCity and like how do you simulate a world, you know, within a computer. And it was just and he got down into the code and down into so good. So stuff like that. So it was fun to like I interviewed Haim, but then I also pulled quotes from his book and like we're all thinking about. It's been crazy how much we've been thinking about play across the years and the perspectives and stuff. And we were saying before, like I met a colleague at a conference once who was Russian. He's like, there's so much about this in Russia, but it's only in Russian, and it's in journals that aren't accessible from here. You have to go to Russia. There's only physical copies. And you need somebody who can help you translate or read them and stuff like that. And it was but fascinating. It's like, well, that's a shame, you know. And this is pre all the craziness, you know. It's still like, that would be hard. But yeah, I love when people start thinking about stuff like that. It got me to think about ways to, like, I feel like I'm better with the students now in terms of changing. Like, I'm talking to students in new ways. When I was the head of the program for 17 years, so there was definitely a hierarchy that's sort of like, if you're coming to me, there's something going on, you know? But now, as a professor, it's like I feel like there's much more generative I noticed just because since I was on sabbatical, there's a group of students that hadn't met me and didn't know me. And the first time I went through quarters, all of a sudden people started showing up into my office because they're like, I want to talk to you more, sort of thing. And I was like, oh, that's, rewarding and humbling, but also just like, oh, I think I'm being better with students because of thinking about things this way. And whereas before I was much more like, what's your problem? I can help you solve it. And who's next with the next problem that I can help solve? Anybody want to share about play in their lives? Sebastian?
All right. I had I don't know if you wanted to say more, but I was really interested in your word cluster that play and games came up so prominently because to me it's not necessarily obvious, and you already started to answer this a little bit, so I don't know if you want to add to this. I had a very naive question though. what did you find? Like, I mean, it was really fascinating to look about the how you went about this, and I find this to be really, I guess, ecologically valid and interesting in terms of establishing sort of constellation, international, or at least, but in terms of some of the the themes that have emerged, and I know you're not completely done with the analysis, but I was wondering if you could tell us more a little bit about this, and then I have a lot less naive question that is also much more closer to me.
That's not naive. You can handle that one. What was the first question? Oh, games and play. I'll do that in the next one. So it's interesting because at least we've got some game like Davidson. We've got some people who do games. So I'd be curious their sense of how games relate to play. A lot of people would go, play is the higher trope, and games are a subset of play that's more structured and contained. I think a lot of people had that sort of perspective on it, like games provide a way to play. So it just seemed to come up a lot, and I was trying so hard because I was trying to get outside of my network because it would be really easy for me to talk to a lot of game designers, and not to too fine a point, a lot of white male game designers. I have a Rolodex full of them, and so I was trying to I was trying to go more diverse, more broad, and I love it because at first I remember I was talking to one of our supporters, and they're like, "You should really focus on games and just games," and I'm like, that feels like I'm not sure I'm ready to commit to just games, because I had these amazing talks with theater people and child psychologists, and I'm so glad I decided not to do that, because that just opened up new. I talked to this one who's a theatrical puppet maker and puppeteer. Oh, just the fun of how they think about play and how they think about it through creating these puppets that, are artificial creations, but when they're on stage, they become a character, and how we seem to it's like what you hear when people talk to the Muppets. They're like, eventually you're talking to Ernie, not thinking there's a hand up a Muppet. And she's like, that's what happens on stage. Everybody's like, it's a horse, even though you can see 4 people, in black moving that puppet. So what did I find? It's still sort of coming together, but to me that it wasn't necessarily a surprise, but it became more and more like the signal became stronger, is to play really, there's this aphorism, if you say something is everything, you're really saying something is nothing, because everything can't be everything, but I was like, play I really do think is everything. It's like every time my wife and I start talking about some topic, like a documentary we're watching, and she's like, you're turning everything into play. She's like, it's everywhere. And I was like, well, I feel like my lens has been turned on for sure. So it just became this really, the signal kept coming stronger. It's how important it is, how we kind of intuitively know that, and how it resonates across fields in ways that are, that's why the oral history became so powerful. It's it feels like, a game designer is talking to somebody who does events, who's talking to an athlete, and they flow. And it was this weird thing when I was making it, the way I used Google Docs, and this was new to me, but it worked so well, is I would open up the same document in 2 windows, and in this window I'd hold my place, and in this window I would scrub through the quotes and kind of go, oh, Heather said this, and it goes really well with what Eric said, and I'll just copy and paste it over. And I'd slowly pull together sections that felt like a good conversation. And then I'd go oh, this is all about improv, and this part of improv, and they're talking about improv in a little different way, so I started splitting up improv. And that's when I'm like, oh my God, and those improv sections really talk, there's a thing about performance and ephemerality of play. And, both like what Dave said, the competitive, sometimes there's competitive play, there's transgressive play, dark play, came up a lot. So these sort of variations of how we think about and experience play, bullies are saying they're playful. And they're like, oh, can't you take a joke? Don't take me seriously, but you're hurting me, And so it was just amazing, just that resonance just kept growing to me in ways I can't even, that's why I was I don't know if I could, I feel like the book right now is 700 plus pages. And I feel well, that's a definition of play. And I think it's not even complete. But it feels of a piece in a way. And so that's what and I can't wait to start doing some quantitative stuff to see what I might have missed, because I'm reading it and it's all in my head. I was like, oh yeah, and I was just talking to a friend who I interviewed, and I was like, you know what's crazy is when I read Eric's interview, and sometimes I'm like, oh, the transcript's a little garbled. I'll go listen to it, and I'll work my way through it, and I'm done. And I feel like I just had a talk with Eric, even though it was, what, a year ago? And, you know, but it's this weird thing where I'm like, these things have been living in my head. And so I kid you not, I've dreamed about it, where I wake up and go, oh my God, I need to do that. Like, since the surveys were all anonymous, I have all these answers, and I was like, do I want to go anonymous 1, anonymous 2, you know, trying to give some sort of attribution to who, and I decided to keep them all just represented as anonymous. And anonymous became the Greek chorus of the book, like reflecting what Heather was saying, what Eric was saying, what Julie was saying, you know. So and I was like, oh my God, it's a Greek chorus. Wow, what the heck? And so the book started changing in my head, and that was a dream. And I was like, oh yeah, it's in me.
So then the other question I had that's closer.
That's not naive, okay.
Was about the other word cloud had very much more prominent than I would have expected. Culture as a central word that was like bigger than the rest, and so
that became my biggest coding was culture.
Yeah, so that made me think of that is not one that I would not necessarily expected to find, but that is of course really interesting to me. And also if you talk to people who are across language lines,
I was going to go there with you. Yeah,
I wonder how that, you know, so. In French, for example, it's all this. That's why I also have a hard time disentangling play and games, because we don't differentiate in French.
Right.
So the word for toy, game, play, to play, be it a sport or music or a game or just to play in general, it's all the same word.
Right.
It's jouer, which of course points to also joie, which is happiness. So I mean, you know, so all of these are in the same lexical bundle, and so then, you know, when I saw culture come up so prominently, I was wondering what these people had said about play and culture, and how that, like, why is that so prominent?
I think it became prominent because I was intentionally trying to talk to people from around the world, and like IGDA was great for that, and Global Game Jam. They helped me get in touch with people like in Africa, and I think I was able to get somebody from every continent except Antarctica. And, you know, and somebody was like, I'll help you with that. And I'm like, you know.
A couple penguins and a few scientists.
And it was weird. And it was weird, too. The way Atlas TI organized everything was by everybody's first name. So I started going like, wow, there sure are a lot of J's. You know, a lot of Johns, James, you know, Jamies, Jessicas. And it's like a lot of S's, you know. I think there's a couple Heathers, you know. So like all of a sudden I was relating to the corpus in this weird way, but personifying these groups of names by it, which didn't have any scientific validity. But anyways, to your question, culturally, yeah, I actually talked to several multilingual, sort of like, I grew up in Chile, then I lived in Canada, and now I live, you know, and it was really weird to be a Chilean living in French Canadian, where, you know, rural French Canada, where somebody from Chile is definitely an outsider, you know. And like both learning English and French on top of their, you know, native tongue. And several people, actually I talked to people from France, I talked to people, a lot of people brought up like, well, in our language, here's how we talk about play. So it lends a different vibe, feel, lens to how we think about it in ways that English is such a mongrel language that, you know, there's like, we make up like, what is it? I was just reading this book about dictionary, where like set, S-E-T, is like the word with the most definitions or something like that. Like English just does all these crazy things. Like Nicole, our friend, she was able to talk about, from her perspective as a multilingual person, you know, stuff like that. And like Jose speaks Spanish, so I talked to a lot of Spanish people. And they talked about, you know, here's how we think about it, and here's what we, you know, and somebody really brought up like the invisible internet, and it's sort of like invisible play of like, if you're only going to English-speaking internet, you're missing so much play because it's inaccessible. You know, like Google's not giving you access to it because you're not able to ask how to get to that and stuff like that. And people in China, like, there's several people in China. I don't know if this is Chinese specifically, but they both shared this idea of play as, from a perspective as child, adult, parent. Like child, you're supposed to play. Adult, you're not supposed to play. Parent, you're going to start playing because you have a child. And I was like, wow, that is interesting that that's how you think about it. And they're like, oh, yeah. And they were a teacher. So, like, I feel like even though it's not my kids, as a teacher, I'm their parent because I'm helping them play. You know, and I was like, I would never say I'm a parent of my students because I wouldn't want them. No, I'm joking. So that came up so much, and people like where I live shapes how I think about play. And that made me start thinking about how I grew up on the water. And I was like, oh, yeah, water's a big part of how I think about. My wife's noticed it's like I'm more easygoing about stuff because it's sort of like, well, the tide comes in, the tide goes out. Here comes a storm, you're going to, you know. And it's a beautiful day, and you're out in the wind, and you're sailing, and wow, nothing's better. Stuff like that. Like we went scuba diving. Like North Carolina coast has the graveyard of the Atlantic because of the Outer Banks roll. With they erode and move, and so there's so many wrecks off the North Carolina Bay. So you can go scuba diving and see all these historic wrecks, and did a lot of that. And I was like, oh wow, yeah, water. And Bruce Lee has some great quotes about how to be like water, and you know, how to think. You know, I was like, yeah, water really shapes my life. And so people were like, how do they conceptualize what play is? And I started tagging that and coding that as culture because it was coming from where they were. And then some people were more specific. I live in Austin, and here's why Austin's amazing. So that got tagged as place. You know, like Seattle, here's what Seattle did. Like a couple people like New York, nothing like it. It just vibrates because it's such a conglomeration of people in such a small area. So that just was really fascinating thinking about how people sort of shape their definitions around, that from their experiences and where they are. So I was coding that as culture. And it just kept coming up. And it was weird at first. Oh, this is interesting as it evolved. At first I was like, oh, family's important, family's important, family's important, family's important. And then I'm like, wait a sec. You're talking about having kids. And you're talking about playing with your parents. So then I was like, well, family and kid, you know, it's like trying to make a distinction between you're saying just having close people. And some people were really good about going, it's my chosen family. Like I'm estranged from my birth family, but I have chosen this family, and that's who's important to me and shaped how I play. And some people are like, oh, it's my mom and my little sister, my brother, you know. A lot of people had like, oh, I had an older sibling, so they introduced me to music, or they introduced me to, you know, they were 4 years older, so they were passing me the things that they thought were cool, and, you know. I was always player 2, sort of thing, and stuff like that. I talked to a twin. And the other twin hasn't followed up yet because I know them both. They're alums, Seth Sivak. Hey, Seth. And he just talked about, you know, growing up as a twin, I never was alone. Like, always played with my twin. They lived together till they were in their 20s. And so it's like a big thing, like, oh my God, it's the first time we're going somewhere else. And I was like, wow, think about that. Because I have a younger sister, and we get along, but we didn't play much together. She likes to joke. She's like, here's the difference between you and I. You sat in your room with the door open. I sat in my room with the door locked. And I was like, yeah, I didn't even think about that. I was like, okay. And she was always like, my mom would go, what'd you do? And I'd tell her the truth. And my sister would try to lie, and you're like, you're going down in flames. You know? Not that I was, like, it was easy, like, it was weird. It wasn't like I was ethical. It was like I was lazy. It's like, I tell you the truth, I don't have to figure out a story. Ethics by laziness. Go ahead. Back row.
Yeah, I think the word culture, very interesting. Wondering if it came up in another way, like the container of play creating a culture.
Ooh, yeah,
or like even how like a team could have a culture, or even how you could show up signaling your cultural capital in a space. Like maybe you have a skin or a hat from like a video game, or maybe you have like the cool Nikes on the basketball team. I don't know. But yeah, just thinking about other ways culture can be applied.
That is so insightful. And yes, it came up both positive and negatives. It was pretty like thinking about games like, oh, the culture of like Fortnite and playing with friends in that. Gamergate came up a couple times for the, you know, Gamergate's the worst of us online, a good example of the worst of us. You know, and I'm doing a gross injustice to how bad it was for people, but yeah, so like that did come up, like how you shape a culture, how you like subsections of like music, like punks for, you know, you're just like, oh, we're this and we're that, and you know, I talked to a couple people. I grew up. Well, I was born in Chapel Hill, and I went to school there, and Chapel Hill had a pretty, at the time, known music scene, late 80s, early 90s. And so it was like things were breaking. Like anybody heard of the Squirrel Nut Zippers? I was lucky to be able to interview one of the band members from Squirrel Nut Zippers, and they were talking about, they wrote a book about the scene, and one of the things that came up was sort of the surprise of the scene was much more sort of poppy grunge-ish. So it was like Seattle's blowing up, Chapel Hill's next. They had like Superchunk and Archers of Loaf and all these bands that were, that's going to break big. And Squirrel Nut Zippers went big, sort of a punk jazz band. And they went to they had top 10 hits and stuff, and nobody would have said, that's the band that's going big. So it's fascinating just the culture of what was happening that caused it to be generative. He talked about this, and I went back, I'm familiar with Brian Eno's concept of scenius. He's sort of scenius is the genius of a community. And he sort of he likes to say one person's not as smart or talented or amazing as a scene of people together. And so then he starts outlining what he thinks makes a scene where it's generative. And so that author used that sort of concept to go, I'm trying to look at why for 10 years Chapel Hill had an amazing music scene that was distinct and distinctive. So a culture was forming in some ways. And some of it's cost of living. It's it's easy for musicians to live there and live on, One of the things I read recently is a lot of the anger we're seeing is we as a culture have seen in just a generation our grandparents being able to go, I was a plumber and I raised 7 kids and I had a vacation home and everything was cool, to that's not possible anymore. And I was just talking to a student who's I'll never be able to buy a house ever, because the boomers bought up all the real estate. And it's getting out of all of our reaches. Both my parents lived on the waterfront. How? I could never afford waterfront property. I'm just one generation down. Stuff like that. And so it's interesting how that develops culture and stuff like that. So really good point of how we shape it through what we're teams, Dave was bringing up. I'm on a sports team. We have a culture. Stuff like that. The groups you in, I think that came up a lot. It's how you make it. One of the things that I thought blew my mind because I didn't think about it. I was talking to a designer. Oh, Europe, I don't want to get the country wrong. I'm horrible. But he and his wife run a secret club. It's not the secret club. It's a secret club, and it's not secret. And that's their sort of playfulness. They do playful events and installations and stuff like that. And while I was talking to him, he said, somehow just in passing, he said, I love bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is so playful. And I was like, well, hold on a second. I want to follow up on that. Because I like to joke that bureaucracy sucks the joy out of life. And, just sucks the kindness out of people. Tell me more. And he was just well, it's these rules that don't make sense, but you have to follow them. And he's for instance, why do you have to get a passport photo a certain way? You have to do this and this, and you have to follow it. If you do it wrong, you don't get your passport. So he's this is a weird game. And he's well, here's what my wife and I did. There was some old, European city that downtown was 800 years old. I haven't read this one recently, so I don't want to guess wrong, but they had a new little mall opening up in downtown. And the city was how can we help people? Hey, there's new shopping. Come downtown. And they decided they're going to do the kickoff at Halloween, and they designed an event where the context was downtown is full of ghosts, except for this new building. It's too young to have ghosts. So we're asking kids to come and apply to haunt the building. And so they show up and they get these big butcher papers with all these rules they have to follow to file their application to be the ghost for the building. And so the rules required them to walk all around of course they're with their parents, and now they're visiting all the stores. They're seeing it. So it's really clever in that. And he's but the kids just ate it up. They were going to make sure they followed the rules because they wanted to be the ghost. He's that's why bureaucracy's fun. And I was oh my God, that's brilliant. It's if they messed it up, they had to start over. Form A doesn't line up with Form B. Go get Form C. And I was oh, you guys are good. They did a voodoo mini golf, and there were all this. It was actually some cultural stuff mixed in, but also just sort of oh, you're going to be cursed, and all of a sudden there's rules change, and you have a zombie following you around the golf course, and again a Halloween thing. Horror's interesting. Horror came up a couple times as a way that sort of for us to understand our psyche and what's got us worried. And there's a huge resurgence in horror right now, both in games and movies and media. And people, Pitt just started a center of study for horror. We have a colleague who does haunted houses. What's that one in Philadelphia? You have to sign a release because they're going to touch you. And it's like, and Harrison's like, I do that. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't want to be grabbed and thrown into another room. Any other questions or comments or thoughts?
One person.
Play's amazing. Then you.
So I'm kind of curious, reflecting on some of this, is like, why did you choose to stop at 175? Like in principle, like they're talking about like this could be your career, and this could be sort of an open conversation. That, I mean, obviously, at some point you need to make a thing that you would define to be a book, but is there anything that feels open or things that you want to explore more that would maybe require more people?
Yes, and part of the reason I stopped was I naively thought, I have a whole year off. I'll get this whole project done in a year. And while I was cracking over 100, and I think come September, I was like, oh my God, I've got to stop. And I had them all scheduled out to November, and I'm like, there's no way I'm finishing it this year. It's like I'll finish it in 2025. It's November now. I think it'll come out in 2026, as long as people are as good as Heather and get their stuff back. Eric? No, joking. So there was a bit of that. I was just like, I need to at least somehow contain it. But the thing that I thought was like, I'm not done. I want to talk to more people. And then the more I talk to, the more exciting it gets for me. So I was like, I'm going to start them back up. But I was just waiting to kind of have something. And Harrison and I were talking too. When you do these sort of oral histories where I'm really looking at collaborators, some people have opted out, which, no harm, no foul. And, just if that takes it outside of where you were comfortable, please let me know, and happy to. A lot of people have adjusted their quotes because they're like, ooh, I said that off the cuff, and that would really upset my family. I'd rather not that be in a book. I'm like, oh, God, I don't need it in there, But also just this idea of somebody might die eventually, and then how do you sort of, it happens. And it's like, how do you handle that when some of, as I've been trying to be sort of opt in, opt out, what do you do? Like, and I lost touch with somebody entirely. Tried to catch up, tried to find them, and couldn't. And that was like, I think I need to pull them out because I can't get their perspective on what I'm trying to do. Because they just got the draft like a month ago, and it's the first time you've seen it. We're like, okay, I really took your stuff out of context, and I edited it so it would fit in the flow. Like I was joking at an earlier talk, I was like, I wasn't going for verbatim because I don't care. No, I'm joking. But I was like, I wasn't trying to be verbatim, capturing exactly. I was like, I wanted it to be like, are you happy with what you shared, and do you think it captures that? And if not, let's change it because it's going to go out. And that felt more like, and the people who they've been great. They keep in touch. They reply. People like the card game didn't come from me. That came from somebody else. The podcast came from it's like people are sharing. Like, could I listen to stuff? Could I play? I could see this. Wouldn't it be fun to have something with visuals where you kind of like have like little koans about play? And some people, I'll pick on Jim G because he's a big boy. He talks in paragraphs, and so he's only in a couple places. But oh my God, he tells these amazing. Some people are just really good at telling these long stories. Whereas I was pulling their quotes, I was like, oh God, those go together. That's a brilliant story. That's of a piece, and it's 5 pages long. Or whatever. And some people are just so pithy. I'm like, clever, 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 clever. I'm just sprinkling it around because they fit so well everywhere. So I was breaking some quotes up because they, and sometimes across a half an hour, 3 times they'd mention soccer. Like, if I could pull that all together, I'd have a nice little thing about soccer and what that meant to them in terms of play. And I'd just do it and go, is that okay?
I had a question about if you saw distinctions between like physical play for people who participate in like something that's like physically active or taxing in some way, whether it's an extreme sport or even just like a board game, versus something maybe like digital or not so as like physically active, if there were like different distinctions between the two and their experiences. I'm asking this because I'm trying to work with people with physical disabilities on designing experiences that are fun and joyful. With them around experiences they can't participate in, or also like don't have kind of a baseline for what makes it fun. For example, like someone said like, oh, I'd love to go like skiing, but I can't do that in real life. So like, oh, I want to design like VR skiing, but I don't know what makes skiing fun. So like things like along those lines.
Yeah, and like I was gesturing as like there's somebody who's really good at this. It did come up. A big thing that came up, and we were talking about beforehand, is not only just the physicality, the embodiment of being in a space together, regardless of sort of, is something that's really hard to replicate digitally and virtually. It's not, you know, there's, like I said, substantial, meaningful relationships can't happen only online, but people get in a space together and something goes on. And so a lot of people talk about, oh, and you get that thing of like, were you at that conference? Did it blow your mind? You had to be there. You can watch a little iPhone video, but if you were there, you're in the crowd and you actually pick up the vibe and the vibrations and stuff like that. And then, so that came up a lot of just like the importance of like that, and kind of going the other extreme, talking to some expert, you know, world-class athletes, that level of satisfaction, and musicians, when you become sort of like world-class, phenomenal because of your physical skills. You're competing on, you're a national champion, a world champion, you know, or you have a hit record or something. So you're operating at that high level, and the satisfaction of developing a skill that far, and how it, they've done some stuff now around memory. Like if you were like a master crafts person, you know, and you're starting to have dementia, you could probably, a lot of them, if you give them their tools, they'll be able to start working right away because they have that sort of embodied memory of what they did their whole life. So that, like taking that extreme, and then the other extreme is like, then how do you design for things for people who can experience skiing? Do you think of ways? And I've seen some designs where they're like, they've got people out who you wouldn't think would go on a slope, and they were able to design a contraption that let them glide down a snowy slope and get that sort of feeling where they're like, oh my God, that was amazing. So you can get, like they've shown, you know, if you just put a kid in a headset who's in a pain, you know, who's suffering from pain, and you show them cold scenes, their pain levels will go down. They're not even getting cooled off, but they mentally start thinking. It somehow has some sort of endorphin impact on it. So like people are really trying to, and I know Heather's just done more detailed work on thinking of ways. She's done projects on this and stuff. And so like if you're doing a project, she might be a good subject matter expert to talk to. And that's what's been fun too, is like part of how it changed my life is I have this group of people. I was trying to be really careful. Like I knew a lot of them. Like I knew Heather, I knew Eric. You know, I talked to Dave's wife. You know, there's people I was interviewing because I was like, oh, it'd be fun to talk to that person. And then I'd always ask people, can you recommend somebody I don't know? Or, you know, so I got people I didn't know, and I've formed relationships that they're keeping in touch, and they're like, all of a sudden I have like, I don't know, I don't want to presume I'm their friend, but we have like a professional relationship that's really positive just from talking for a half hour. And there was this weird thing that happened that was so powerful. It's like most of them were a half hour-ish. Some people won't pick on the people who went over an hour. Like Sandy Stone, she went over an hour. She was awesome though. Almost to a T, everybody would go, oh my God, that was so refreshing. I never talked that much. And I was like, just attending to somebody is almost like a gift. And then like sharing this like grace of a moment together where we're really listening to each, like I was actively listening to people. And so I was like taking notes and going, Dave said this thing about sports. I'm gonna make sure I bring that back up. And in a weird half-hour conversation, I could see connections where this happened pretty regularly, where somebody's like, when I was a kid, I did this, and now professionally, I do this. And I'd go, oh my God, did you ever see that connection? And some people are like, yeah, that makes sense to me. And some people are like, oh my God, I never thought about that. But it makes perfect sense, you know. Like one person talked about when they were a kid, they loved cardboard boxes. And they like putting boxes in boxes and getting everything organized. And they're like, and now I'm a professional producer, and it makes sense. I'm always organizing and, you know, and stuff like that. And they had that metaphor of like, it's all boxes and boxes. And I was like, oh yeah, my metaphor is water. The tide, it comes in, it goes out. Changes every day, but. And so yeah, it's crazy, fun, powerful. And it's like just a half hour talking to each other, and I felt closer to people. And like, I know Heather pretty well, but she told me things I didn't know. And so that was also too. It's like, oh, I'm going to talk to Heather, and I know what she's going to say. I did not know what Heather was going to say, and she shared stuff where I'm like, wow, layers I was unaware of. And that was really fun. Is talking to people I thought I knew well, and I'm like, I had no idea. Like one colleague who's a academic in games ran a video game store, on the side in Chile in the 80s, and like it was going really big. And he's like, I might still be there. We kind of said no, we're not going to do Magic, and now I'm like, why did we say no to Magic? I think we'd still have the store if we'd said we'll carry Magic cards. And I was like, you ran a shop? What the heck? Stuff like that. Everybody's weird stuff. No, that was Jose. I could see Gonzalo doing it too. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Oh, yes.
This may be coming out of left field. I taught design for many years, and I found myself, and even now, just talking about my work, I use the word play in saying, this is a pretty good idea. Why don't you play with it? Move it forward, So over the weekend, do some sketches and bring those ideas, But I use the word play. I mean, thinking about it now, because I didn't want them to be seriously like, oh my God, we've got to stay within the boundaries and all that. Just develop it, take it forward, but have fun with it. But I use the word play a lot, and I'm curious, did anybody talk about play in similar ways?
Yeah.
Okay.
That came up, and it kind of relates to what Sebastian said. I had a couple people who English was their second language, and they were distinctly going, it's amazing how metaphoric play is in English, because it can be like, play around with ideas. Yeah. I went to a play. I am playing a sport, and they're like, play, how do you know what play means, even when it seems to mean so much? And they're like, and in my language, it's distinct, or, it's all together, it's just one word. And it was interesting when I was came up with the idea of like, well, this version that's everything's threaded together, I'm gonna call it Playing Around. And I was just making sure I had the title correct, so I was doing a search. So many people mentioned that in there, they just use that term. I like playing around with ideas, or I have the team play around, or so a lot of people think of it. And like, I talk a lot with our students when they're trying to do something creative. I always sort of say, if you know exactly what you're doing and how you're gonna do it, you're not being creative. And I was like, going further, it's like creativity needs playfulness. Like you have to like get into the unknown and the unexpected, and maybe it won't work. And now you're starting to play with ideas, as opposed to, like you said, like, okay, just do exactly. Like sometimes some of our students, I'm sure a lot of, will be like, just tell me exactly what to do and I'll do it, and just give me an A for doing exactly what you asked for. I'm like, well, that's not creative. AI will do that for me. Do the thing that you've never done before, and sometimes you'll fail. And hope, at least in school, that's just you tried. Thanks, Heather. Totally understand. Yeah, that was that sort of came up. The fascinating thing, I was talking to a student, like, oh, I can't make it. I'm busy and I'm in a meeting. And a lot of you, like, even said, I have a busy day. I might not be able to make it. And it's sort of what was so like powerful to me is like, that's me too. I often say I'm too busy or I can't do it or something like. But man, if you just make a half hour, an hour, like my wife and I have been really hardcore about coming out of the pandemic. We go for a walk in the woods every day. Even like right now, it's hard because like it's about 7:45 when we hit the woods, because it's got to be light, I'm looking forward to next week. Well, that'll be 6:45, and I can get out there. And so it's like that kind of comes into play where we're like, no, let's take the time to do this. And that was this weird thing of like, that's where I think, to Heather's question, I've become more generous with students. Because I used to be like so busy. I'm like, can I solve your problem? We're done. See ya. And I almost like, now I have to, my brain goes somewhere else. And now it's like, well, let's really spend a little time talking. And oh my God, that's changed me a lot. It's just like, I'm getting to know people different and better and stuff like that. But yeah, the playing around thing comes up a lot with creativity and a process as opposed to like, check, check, check. I mean, I think one of the underlying things around AI, and AI came up a lot in the interviews, like, it's interesting, like AI came a lot, struggle came up a lot, like I want to play, but here's what's stopping me from playing, or playing can be so hard to do within certain contexts, or, because play's not always easy. Sometimes you play, like video games, has anybody broken a controller? just out of frustration, but you're playing for fun. It's like, I'm enjoying this, but I just damaged equipment, Like we used to get Rock Band for our students' lounge, and they'd break it once a year. And after a while, we're like, GSA, your GSA funds will pay because you're breaking it regularly out of just like exuberant play, And so that's just sort of fascinating to me, is like thinking about those ways that it can be testy and risky, and I think part of the reason AI is so kind of hitting us is like, can the corporate suits, the business people who'd love to fire people, like Amazon just announced they're firing 30,000 people for AI. It's because they would like to be able to push a button and get creative instead of just dealing with the messiness and the chaos of us trying to come up with ideas, and maybe it might work and maybe it won't, and you can't can you on demand give me the perfect idea in 10 minutes? No, I need to think about it. There's a great, I think it was in Comedian in Cars Getting Coffee, that Jerry Seinfeld podcast, whatever video series, where he was with Lorne Michaels. And Lorne Michaels is a very business person, and they were walking through Saturday Night Live's back area. And he's like, it always amazed me that the writers, it's like they're monkeys. They're in the hallway, they're playing Nerf gun fights. If you're sort of evaluating it, you go, no, nothing productive is getting done here. And then a show happens, and it's hilarious. And he's like, he's learned, I gotta let them be the monkeys to let the creativity happen. And you think that nothing's happening, but the generative stuff's happening as they socialize and get out of the writing room and come back to the writing room. And I think some people would rather control it. That's the thing coming out of the pandemic, where CEOs are like, we need you back in the office, 9 to 5. I want to see butts and seats. I'm like, that's so old school. I can be productive anywhere. And probably need to leave to come back to be more productive. And stuff like that. And so I love, just thinking about things like that, and encouraging our students to think about ways. Because this was interesting when we're talking about AI. I like to use an example of my wife. You've seen her art. That big felt piece that she did that she calls Heath. My wife did this thing. It's all felted. Huge, 6x6 thing, all these little felted panels. And on each panel, she put an object that meant something to her. And it's called Heath, which means memory. And so this huge, it's beautiful aesthetically, but if you start talking to her about it, she'll tell you the story of what's up on the piece. And I was really fascinated because it means a lot to her, and we enjoy it and like it, and it's fun to share when somebody comes by because it's sort of crafty / artistic / it's dusty. It collects so much dust. It just seems to be, it's like, I'll suck all the dust to me. I was messing around with AI generation, and I was taking pictures of sunsets. And you can expand frame and you can't even tell, because AI is seeing a gazillion sunsets. So it's gonna make me a sunset and I can't tell it's fake. But I put my wife's a picture of her felted piece, and when I hit, create this, it looked like a nightmare come true. It was just lost the texture, it was skewing, didn't know it, and I was like, it's because it's never seen anything like that. So AI didn't know what to do, so it just guessed, as that's all AI is really doing. And I was like, so I like to tell our students, if all you want to do is do what you're told or make sunsets, AI is going to steal your job. If you want to do things that mean something and nobody else can make it, you'll always have a job. And then somebody brought up, through the interviews, because I was telling somebody that story, and they're like, well, what if one day AI can make that? They can make something that you think, oh, that looks like my wife's work, even though it's never seen it before. Because that might be possible. We have some technical people going, yeah, I could see AI figuring that out. And the answer that came up as we were talking about it was, but what AI can't do is become the person who can create that work. You're Dan Boyarsky because of the work you went through to become the artist and the designer who you are. And having a button just go, I have art, means you don't become Dan Boyarsky. You become somebody who can push a button. And so that process is what AI can never replace, I think. I think it could still make stuff that's usable. It's interesting because, in the game industry, I just had an interview with a company that are like, we're trying to make an artificial artist that can do everything for you, so you don't have to hire artists. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't know if companies will want that. And they're like, really, why? Because they're technical people, and we're trying to solve a technical problem. I was like, well, I talked to a lot of people in the game industry, and most of them want the team to get paid for the work they do. And like, you know, the artists to do, you know, don't shop that out. And like, you know, it happens in game competitions now. It's like if somebody says they made it with AI, it usually gets, you know, passed on immediately by the judges. Even if like we had one project where I thought they did brilliant stuff with AI that it was worth thinking about in a competition, but they just said no to it because they had AI usage. Couldn't somebody have done, you know? So there's a value system and an ethics structure, you know, and all kinds of problematics about AI. Like I'm not scared of AI, I'm scared of capitalism and what it's going to do with whatever tool it has. And it's like, let's, you know, wreak havoc with that. We're in late stage capitalism. It's just like bucking for the next. We're seeing that it's all a Ponzi scheme once they run out of growth areas, stuff like that. Not to end on a positive note. Thanks, Dan. Anything else before we go? Like I love that you all were asking questions and attending to stuff. Like these conversations. I wish we could do a meal together because eating's food, and Dave's got good taste in music, so he can send us out with some stuff. Oh yeah, like we're gonna do a version at the Children's Museum because they have a kitchen, and they're like, yeah, they're like, oh, we could do it right here. It'll be during Remake Learning Days. Like I'm good friends with Jane, and I was telling her, she's like, why don't you do it here? So like sometime next spring, probably April, May. Oh yeah, man, you have a little labyrinth down there. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for your time and attention and coming on a busy Wednesday. Really appreciate it. Y'all have a great day. We'll talk more.